Mr. Nick Howard.
Mr.
Hello.
Wayne.
All right, so this is our first episode of the non-technical poker stuff. So we are gonna be covering more mindset and mental game aspects of poker. Why do you think this is important, Nick?
Oh, this is definitely my favorite part of poker. I think I got more interested in it as time went on, mainly because I started to see, the major thing that I saw from being a coach and a player is that a lot of good players, seemingly good players, could get access to the same content and have radically different results. And when I observed myself, I saw various different versions of myself playing with the same strategy, depending on my mood in a given day or any number of variables. So originally, I kind of came from the mindset that if you give a guy a good strategy, that guy's going to win. And over time, I've gravitated towards kind of accepting the fact that the technical side of things is probably, I don't know how to put a percentage on it, but depending how out of alignment your mindset could almost definitely be worth more than technical. I don't think it's really valuable to put like numbers or percentages on which one's more important. I think you kind of have to look at it as if they're both equally important almost. And you got to keep up with both sides of it. Otherwise, you're going to potentially create an imbalance that causes you to spin out into a hole that you can't really crawl out of. And that's been the most painful thing to watch, I think, is seeing guys that have mindset imbalances that they ignore, who are otherwise really strong technical players, who go into a bad downswing and just can't recover from it, period. Puts them out of the career.
Definitely agree. And I guess I would say that mindset, in my opinion, should always be slightly ahead of your technical ability. And the reason I say this, which is me saying that mindset is more important than technical ability, the reason I say this is because when it comes to mindset, if you don't have the right mindset, it's very easy to get caught up in situations that are too complex or strategies that are too complex for you to implement right now. And only if your mindset is mature enough can you understand that oftentimes your strategy just has to be a simple enough one for you to be able to execute on.
Totally. The biggest skill, I think, is to identify the strength of your current mindset and then connect that to a strategy that you can handle at the time. And this is probably the hardest thing, specifically observing guys that come into the Coaching for Profits program that I run. We separated into divisions 1, 2, 3, 4, with 4 being the highest and 4 has the most advanced content. And what we constantly see with guys who struggle and fail out of division 1 and 2 is that they can't accept that they don't know everything that's in division 4. Even though we have proof that division 1 and 2 players can easily move to division 4 if they execute division 1 and 2 content consistently. It's this urgency thing that creates a level of anxiety in a player where if he can't get all the answers, then for some reason it paralyzes him to even be able to implement a consistent, simple strategy. People hate the idea of the word simple. I've almost been trying to come up with a different word for it because they associate simple with basic and then it's not attractive in some way. But if you talk to a lot of winning players, especially I rely almost on my division 4 players to communicate to my division 1 players to build their trust, because constantly what people will say after going through an intelligent learning curve is people are radically underestimating the power of a simple strategy if executed consistently. I think that's the biggest disconnect, is that you have a bunch of people who can't accept the fact that simple is actually better and that there are more advanced levels, but you can't just skip to them. You can't just fast forward past the middle zone of doing all the work. So this idea of identifying where you're at with your mindset, what type of tools you can handle, and then really accepting the fact that you've got to work with the tools that you have and get results with them before you get sharper tools. I think it's super important.
Maybe another word to use instead of simple is resilient, because oftentimes these quote unquote simple strategies, they are not exactly simple in the theory behind it. It's just simple to execute. And these simple strategies often cover like 80% of the most important things.
Right.
And
yeah, that's a good point. I think a good word for that is a heuristic. Like realistically, what you're trying to do with a quote unquote simplified strategy is you're trying to take a concept and simplify it, or maybe a better word is to distill it. And by distilling it, you capture 80% of the value of that zone by creating a rule of thumb or something simple that you could operate on as a heuristic. You come up with enough of those and you have something that looks pretty straightforward, but it actually it packs a pretty big punch because it's taking care of most of the game tree. Now, what I'm saying, connecting that back to earlier, is that like the 20% that the heuristic can't cover, those nuanced zones, that's what tends to really bother people. They can't accept the fact that they don't have full information, and it causes them to basically self-destruct. So that's the skill set I think that is really worth looking for in a player. Like if I was going to assess a player's potential, and I'm still looking for a way to like test for this, I want to know how well he can handle not having full information. And that actually is much deeper than it seems on the surface. It almost sounds like cliche, but like when you truly start to see how many players self-destruct because they don't know how to navigate uncertainty, you start to give it a lot more credit, and it becomes kind of like almost the most important thing I would look for in a player's personality.
Yeah, you mentioned that when you were coaching your CFP students, there is a lot of struggle with kind of problem solving in a rational way when there is missing information or when there is that aspect of uncertainty. So why don't we address this topic a little bit more in detail, where maybe you elaborate how you explain this to your
Sure.
Students?
It's definitely a developing conversation. I learn a lot from not just playing myself and observing my development, but I learn probably the most from observing the players talking to each other. They're always posting hands in the private community that we have, and I get to see sort of like how they approach the uncertainty of the game. Like there's always hands that they don't have full technical answers to. They can't look it up anywhere. And it's the point at which they have to start thinking rationally for themselves. And the Division 4 guys are just naturally better at deconstructing a problem in rational terms and organizing it in a way that it comes out coherent. Time and again, what you notice with the earlier division guys is that they're trying to find certainty where it just doesn't exist. And when you do that, when you encounter a problem that just naturally has missing information, and you can't accept the fact that it's crossed that threshold where you can't solve it scientifically anymore. There's no data left to support your analysis. If you can't toggle into that intuitive, rational thinking mode, almost like a more qualitative analysis, where you're just kind of like feeling through what feels the most important. It's very hard to describe. It's almost abstract, which is why I'm still trying to find good language for it. But it's a very intimate process to navigate to navigate uncertainty is very, very intimate. And I think it puts you face to face with the deepest parts of your insecurities, because if you think about what cognitive dissonance actually is, it is the response to uncertainty in the environment. You can trace it all the way back to fight or flight. I like to just call it like vulnerability these days. When people feel vulnerable or under threat, cognitive dissonance initiates, which then creates distortion, which then causes people to make bad decisions due to the uncertainty of the situation. As soon as the uncertainty settles in, people get paranoid, they go into a fight or flight response, and they start solving problems based on fear-based distortion instead of rational evidence. So what I try to help guys with is not so much even solving the hand history. That's not my approach. Like, somebody posts 5 hands in the chat, I could really care less what the answer to the hands are. I want to find out what the thing that you're doing is that's causing you to approach that problem in an irrational way. Constantly what you find is that people are trying to overanalyze. And in the overanalysis, they lose sight of the fact that they're no longer being scientific. They've gone past the point of just using the data that they have, and now they're speculating. And they're speculating because they want certainty. But in that grasping for certainty, they're becoming distorted. So there's a very thin line, and it's very hard to point out, but I think it is the real skill of the game. And I think it transfers to other industries too, which is why I think it's one of the reasons I like talking to you the most, I think, is because you're already on a trajectory where you understand that the skill sets, the mindset skill sets that you develop through poker are very compatible with real world success. There's a thing that I really liked that I read the other day. It said, like, in terms of goal setting, the goal is not the goal. This is like a new paradigm of goal setting. The goal is not the goal. It's the mindset that you develop on the way to the goal that sticks with you for the rest of your life. So you're not setting goals to complete goals. You're setting goals to figure out who you actually are as someone striving for a goal. And then the skills that you pick up through that process are actually the ones that make it more likely that you hit your next goal. So realistically, I think it would be healthy for everybody in poker to treat it as an apprenticeship to something bigger in life. Because realistically, like, if we looked at the data, 1% of players are going to stay in this for like a decade and just make this the career for the rest of their lives. The rest of us are going to move on to something else. And if you really approach this as like an apprenticeship to doing deep level mindset work, I think it's way more healthy than, putting all this pressure on yourself to, become the best high stakes player or something like that. I want to hear what you saw when you decided that you were going to transition out of, like, I think a paradigm shift always sort of happens there. And I know we have a lot of same people in our network, and I know you probably got the same advice as I did from some guys who had already transitioned out. But like, what was that moment for you where you sort of realized, oh, the skills I've developed in poker could be leveraged in a potentially bigger arena? Like, these problem solving skills relate to life.
Well, I would say that it's not just one paradigm shift that happened that moved me out of poker. It involved multiple paradigm shifts. I mean, I think like at least 4 or 5. The first of which that happened when I was playing poker was when I reached the ceiling in terms of playing the biggest games in Macau. Basically, the biggest public games were, you could only play bigger if you became good at networking and became good at people skills. So at that point, the most beneficial path for me became to work on myself and to work on networking. So it became like I reached a ceiling of complexity where I couldn't grow more in poker unless I worked on myself as a human being, and to connect. So that was one of the first driving factors that made me realize that, hey, life skills and poker skills, or the skills to make money in poker, are very similar. So that was the first one. The second one is when I realized that poker is a zero-sum game and it doesn't meet some of my needs. So that was a very big paradigm shift that I had, realizing that if I'm simply just playing poker to make money, that's not something I want to do in the long term. And then realizing, I guess the third thing is that the level of mindset training that we get as poker players, generally due to it being very short feedback loops and the results being very close to what level you are performing at mentally, that made me, that kind of taught me a lot of lessons in poker that I am now finding it very useful in everything else that I do. those would be the key ones. But to answer your question, in terms of what made me actually realize that the things that I've learned in poker applies to everything else, I think I realized this like really early on in my career when I first started playing poker. I always saw poker as a miniature version of life in many ways. It's kind of like it's like poker has. I would imagine poker to be in a bubble, and there's a lot of miniature versions of life things like how to deal with your emotions, how to take care of yourself, how to sleep better, how to perform better. A lot of these things that apply to poker as much as it applies to life, but it's just a smaller version of it. And this smaller version allowed me to see things because it's a smaller version. A lot of things I get quicker results for seeing how my performance actually affects my results.
Than you would in like if you had to just only explore the larger bubble of life. It's almost like you can simulate a mini version of your own mindset performance through poker. I mean, I can't get over how efficient of a catalyst is for mindset development, how efficient poker is as a catalyst for mindset development. I think the thing that really hit me this year was that the reason that it's so difficult, which is what makes it so accelerated of a catalyst for growth, is that if you take a look at what's happening in the landscape of the game, it's a game where due to the pot odds relationship, if you think about like if somebody bets into you and you're getting 2-1 to call, you can be making correct decisions because you're getting odds and you're not getting rewarded even half the time. And that dynamic really jacks up the cognitive dissonance because the mind has to learn how to deal with doing something correctly without getting positive reinforcement or validation for it. And that really is what I think is probably the most hardened skill set that you can develop. Like that, when I think back through the last decade, I think learning how to deal with that phenomenon is what gets you closer to being carved out of wood instead of just being like a little ball of jelly, which is what I think when I look at a lot of newer players, I just see that they're not resilient, I guess. It's like, that's where I would really like to use that word, is like, I don't see they have the mental resilience to deal with the structure of the investment model that they're in. Because this is a very harsh investment model. And then if you take it to life, like life can be equally high variance at times and equally volatile. So I think poker players, if they go through the motions of the mindset development, end up being more prepared to handle the volatility of life because we're just acquainted with dealing with that type of environmental response. We're acquainted with something going wrong constantly. And I feel like it's a difficult place to put yourself in that arena voluntarily is extremely difficult as a decision to make. But I think it's extremely rewarding if you stick with it and actually learn how to navigate on that level, because you just become more rational. You become able to navigate the hard zones of life in a more rational way.
Yeah, I have 2 points regarding that. The first is that it's really strange how people are really bad at handling things that are roughly in the 10 to 40% range of it happening. So
10
because
to
you're gonna
40?
huh?
10 to 40, you said?
Yeah, roughly around that range. Because if it's more than 50, it becomes the feedback loop is just you're gonna have positive results more often than negative results. But when
Right.
it's slightly less than half, you kind of expect it to happen enough. And even though the payout might be high enough such that you have a positive expected value and it's a good decision, it's very hard to deal with it emotionally. And that's probably the point you're addressing. But then when it comes to less than 10%, right? It kind of changes. So people just don't expect to win anymore. It's like kind of like if you buy lottery, for example, people buy it not expecting to win, and if they don't win, it's okay.
That said, if something happens to you that should not happen more than 10% of the time, that can be world ending. So like if you get one outed, for instance, I get what you're saying, that like if I go buy a lottery ticket and I lose, I'm not devastated. But if I get it all in and the guy has one out in a big pot and he hits it, that can really throw a player through a loop. So it's just interesting to see how we respond to low frequency events that are realistic, even though they're improbable, depending on what side of the equation we're on, really dictates how we take it to heart. And I think it shows that when something happens to you that's very, very unlikely, like someone sucks out on you when you have the near nuts, somebody hits like a 2% one outer on you, the way that most people experience such a harsh reality, like such a difference in what they expected as opposed to what reality is offering, it triggers the core of their victim narrative. And we all have one to some extent. And so like poker is really interesting in the sense that like, if you have that going on in you, it's not going to allow you to hide from it. Like it will push it to the forefront, because if you play long enough, that thing is going to happen. That really unlikely thing is going to happen to you. And you're going to be brought face to face with how you interpret that event. To me, I think that's what is the most difficult and the most potentially opportunistic part of the game, is that you get a chance to actually see how your mind responds when shit hits the fan, basically.
Yeah, you're right. The victim mentality, I couldn't agree more. It really forces you to confront your demons with that. It's not an easy thing to deal with, to be honest. We often feel like, I mean, when you get one outed, the natural instinct is to feel like a victim.
How
And
could this happen to me?
Huh?
How could this happen to me? I'm so unlucky. This wouldn't happen to anybody else, basically.
Yeah, and the focus and attention is on you being a victim and on that event. The more you put your focus on that event, that's where your energy flows, right? And there isn't a positive outcome when you focus on the negative aspect of it, because those are things that are out of your control.
That's why I really like the angle of coaching that tries to expose where a student has a structural misconception of the game. I heard a cool quote once, I forget where it's from, but basically somebody who was really smart and successful said, when people tell me that something doesn't make sense, what they're basically saying is reality is not operating in the way that I think it operates. Something like this. And it's like trying to hint at the fact that all of our problems could be solved if we had a balanced view of how reality actually works. And I think a lot of poker players think they understand what they're getting themselves into when they insert themselves into this type of investment model. But then the one outer happens and you realize that someone has absolutely no real idea of how inevitable that thing is over time. So what I'm focused on mainly with some of the new content that I'm creating is, I think there's a progression that you can go through as a coach where what you're trying to do with any student is identify where he has a structural misconception of how the game works. Like maybe he just doesn't understand that when he calls with a bluff catcher on the river, that he's not supposed to win anywhere near half the time. If he calls expecting to win more often than not in that spot, he's setting himself up for a world of hurt, because that's not how the reality of the situation works. He's going to lose that spot the majority of the time. So that's the first part of it. Like you work through all the zones of the game. Do people understand variance? Do they understand bankroll management? Like all these things that you kind of need to have a structural grip on. And once you get those out of the way, you hit this line in the sand where if he understands how the structure of the model works, then you come to a point where if he still is not able to accept the structure, now he's on the human problem side of things. So one of the other coaches in my executive group basically likes to say, all we're really trying to do as coaches is find out where a poker problem turns into a human problem. And that's an important distinguishment to make, because we can fix the poker problem by just using simple technical explanations. But to fix a human problem, we've got to go into more deep belief mindset work to get to the bottom of why you can't accept the way that reality actually works. And that is, I think, the most interesting part of everything. I think I definitely have more of an obsession with that than a lot of other players I speak to. I think most players think that more things can be solved on the technical scientific end. And if you just had the strategy, you're good. And I'm more in the camp of like, I don't believe the strategy is the full picture at all, because I don't think you can implement the strategy consistently if you have all this stress built up. I mean, there's just a ton of stuff that can happen. It can cause you to misread a hand, misread a decision point. It can cause you so much stress that you can't even play consistently. There's so many bad negative effects of stress buildup. And what causes stress more than anything is when you don't have an accurate viewpoint over the reality of the investment model that you're in. So to me, that's the important distinguishment, I think, is it a poker problem or is it a human problem? Let's get to the bottom of that, because then we know where the real work needs to get done.
Yeah, when I was playing the highest games in Macau, very often I see people that have human problems. Those human problems often show up as in their poker game. And so in order to actually maximize a lot of the exploit spots, it really isn't about understanding strictly how they play poker, but it's also about understanding their problems as a human. When I started to see that and I started to understand the flaws in their logic as a human, I understand how to exploit them in poker much better. Like, my point is that there isn't a very big difference, or there often isn't any difference at all between their poker problems and their personal human problems.
Nice. There's a saying, I don't think that my guys created it, but it floats around a lot in my group. How you play poker is how you do everything else in life. And I think this can be like, how you do anything is how you do everything. I think that's like the original saying. But you start to get really sensitive to this type of stuff. Like, the first thing I do when I meet a student in real life or a poker player in real life is I'm really paying attention to some of the subtle nuances of the way that he navigates reality. Like, even if I'm in a car with someone, the way that they drive indicates to me the way that they probably handle problem solving under intense situations. And so that it almost is to the point where, like, I wish I could turn it off, but it's just how my mind thinks now. It's like, okay, like, I can learn way, way more about how the inner workings of someone's mind works just by paying attention to how they navigate certain situations. Because it's a gradient. People do things in an infinite amount of ways, but if someone is far enough on one side of the spectrum, that's a very important data point that you can connect to how they probably handle other situations when under stress. So if I had to classify it in a general way, it's like, is this guy defaulting towards aggression or passivity? Or does he respond to stress by fighting back or fleeing? So it's like, you're constantly trying to figure out, maybe at the most basic level, how does someone respond to discomfort? And if you can figure that out, you have a pretty lethal weapon to be able to leverage against them across a lot of different spots, because that complex, a person's core set point for whether or not he defaults passive or aggressive, is probably the most important read you can have on the player, I would say, because it's consistent. It's very hard to fake. Like, it's the thing that's going on at the root of their reality. And if it's left uninvestigated, they're not even aware of it. And I know this firsthand. Like, the biggest problem that I fixed in my career, and this is only something I was able to get a grip on over the last year, my worst beats, heads up especially exposes to me. The guys that just crushed me the most in heads up, when I reviewed those matches, what I saw was that I was doing this thing consistently where the match would spin out of control, or so I thought, and I would reach for control to try to get it back, and my opponents would just clip my legs out from under me because I was overextended. And I could never see how I was doing it to myself because it was just the way that I was trying to reestablish control. But that was my imbalance. I wasn't someone who folded too much under pressure. I was someone who lashed out under pressure. Both are bad. And now what I try to do is just get a grip on where someone is and not beat myself. It's very like samurai code, but like I like this idea that you're always just trying to figure out, you're always just trying to let your opponent beat himself, basically. You're just there observing where he's going to overextend himself or leave himself vulnerable in some way, and then you capitalize on that. It's much less about how am I going to dominate. That was the paradigm that I left behind that I think was very healthy. And then when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, this is how good players win. This is how really good players beat good players. They wait for the good player to beat himself. And that can happen both ways. It can happen when one player is over aggressive or when one player is too passive. The point is the very good player is observing you very closely and he's not overextending himself in the process.
Yeah. I mean, from a poker context, it's very often you have to play like a defensive strategy, like or what people would call a GTO strategy, and you approximate it as closely as you can to the best of your ability, and then you try and analyze where your opponents are overextending themselves. To be honest, in my time playing poker, I've really yet to see anybody that doesn't overextend themselves in some way. That's the beauty of it, where this kind of mindset thing of understanding the human and then understanding where they're likely to overextend themselves and then that becoming a leak in their poker game, this kind of pathway is a very mindset thing, and that's where you really craft